All right, we're in Chapter 11, Section 2, Net Neutrality, From Neutrality to War. Why does this matter? Although Americans wanted to avoid fighting with another foreign war, they sent aid whenever their allies were threatened. What's going to happen is there's going to be one change in the mindset, which is how do we stay neutral, and that's going to change after the invasion and attack on Pearl Harbor. So just to kind of review the concept of neutrality means that we're going to stay neutral. We talked about that in the sense of World War I. We said we were remaining neutral. However, we know now from history that most of our actions were not neutral. So in World War II, we're going to take on a different perspective and try to remain neutral as we don't want to be dragged into another conflict. So most Americans, again, sympathize with the Allies. They were determined to avoid the war. Isolationists formed American First Committee, and the members thought the U.S. should keep out of Europe's business. And once again, this is the whole idea that Europe is constantly entrenched in war, so why would we want to send our sons and daughters overseas to fight in something that they could have avoided in the first place? So in looking this out, President Roosevelt, he's preparing for war the whole time. He's trying to make sure that we're ready in case something does happen. In 1938, Congress is going to vote to strengthen the Navy. In 1939, he's going to pass the Neutrality Act, where the U.S. could basically sell weapons on a cash and carry basis. And what that means is we already knew that Europe was in debt, and we knew, like Germany, for instance, didn't have much funding after World War I because we were the ones who were financing it. The reparations of war. So if they didn't have cash to be able to buy those weapons, how were they going to be able to buy them? So we knew that pretending to remain neutral and using that cash and carry system would make us be able to sell things when we need to. In 1940, FDR is going to sign the Selective Training and Service Act. It's the first time there's going to be a peacetime draft. And this is going to apply for males who are between the ages of 21 and 35, just to make sure that there's enough people there in the case that something happens in the future. In 1940, there was an election, and both President Roosevelt runs for a third term. He breaks tradition set by George Washington, and he continues on. Republican opponent was Wendell Willkie. Roosevelt promised, your boys are not going to be sent to any foreign wars. And he won a very easy election, which was predicted because he was so popular based off of his New Deal and his handling of the situations in the Depression. Now, again, the concept of having no third term and the importance of this is this doesn't exist any longer. But in the past, we've always had a peaceful transition from president to president, and usually within a two-term radius. So this is going to break tradition. So there's going to be growing involvement. Roosevelt's going to move to openly support the Allies. Again, campaigned on the idea that he was going to keep us out of war, but he approves the Lend-Lease Act, which is when the U.S. could sell, lend, or lease arms to other war supplies to nations considered vital to the defense of the United States, basically to the people who are our friends, the people we're going to support. Britain was the first organization or the first country to use the Lend-Lease, and isolationists of the time really are going to oppose this act because it knows it's going to set up a precedent for things to change in the future. So the next thing to look at here, this is a political cartoon. I find it really interesting. It's got a little bit of blur on it on the screen, so I apologize. But what you see is two different cartoon aspects. The first one is hands across the sea, which is basically symbolizing Uncle Sam lending a hand across to our allies who are across the ocean in Europe. But then at the bottom it says, but arms across the sea, no. Part of this, the isolationist frustration, was that the financial cost of the U.S. before the war and after World War I, money was spent on munitions and food and other purchases. It came to more than $10 billion. Britain and France, along with the other Allied countries, had not paid any of this back in the debt. So whenever World War II broke out, we were like, do we keep digging ourselves a bigger hole? And how do we go through losing more money, especially when most of our people are still struggling to eat in the Great Depression? So the cartoon presents a play on the word hand and arms to make the first point. The first panel shows the extended arm across the sea with the two countries, hands clasped in friendship. And the second panel, it shows arms to take on a different meaning with the cartoonist statement, In this case, arms refers to the military support and weapons. So we're willing to be your friend, but we're not willing to give you arms or support you in that war cause. So the growing involvement, what's going to happen is we're going to basically get antagonized into a war in some way. This doesn't really have a major effect, of course, until Pearl Harbor, but we kind of have this concept that we know things are coming. German submarines were sinking British ships. Some were carrying supplies from the United States. So American ships started to escort British merchant ships. The Germans began to fire on the American destroyers, and Roosevelt issued a shoot-on-sight order. So, again, as much as we're trying to remain neutral, it's just not happening. Final part we'll look at is the Atlantic Charter. In 1941, Roosevelt met Winston Churchill and drafted the Atlantic Charter. Winston Churchill is going to be the leader. He won the election to Parliament in Europe in the 1900s, raising his name to the head of the British Navy in 1911. In the years leading up to World War I, he spoke out repeatedly against Hitler's aggression, and becoming the Prime Minister of the nation, he increased an intense effort to defeat Germany. He became known for his public speaking skills and for his patriotism towards the war. The Conservative Party he had power over after the war, but he served as Prime Minister from 1951 until his retirement in 1955. But Roosevelt and Churchill set goals for world power after the destruction of the Nazis. He pledged every nation would be free to choose their own type of government, and he urged disarmament, meaning that he wanted every country to be freed of military incurrence, so to stop the war or any potential wars in the future.